On behalf of the Forest Landowners Foundation, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is Lauren Ward. I just came on recently as the new president of the Forest Landowners Foundation, and I'm very excited to be here today to introduce our webinar topic, which is costs and trends of Southern forestry practices. Just to give you a little bit of background about the partnership between the foundation and Auburn University on this project, the costs and trends survey and report has been around for several decades now. It goes back a long way, so we really have been able to track some of these costs and trends over a long period of time. However, this survey has also undergone many changes over the years, as you can imagine, given the changes that have happened in forestry in general and forest land ownership and the management practices that are being applied on the ground. So we're really excited this year to share with you some of the exciting changes that we have brought about in partnership with Auburn to this survey to make it easier for landowners to take and to make it easier for landowners and other land managers to access the results and view the data that we've gathered through this program. So we're excited to share that with you today. I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker in just a moment, but before we move to that, I would like to say thank you to the foundation supporters who help make these types of partnerships possible. And thank you to the U.S. Forest Service as well for grant support that helped us to achieve a lot of progress this year in making this project even more meaningful and more useful to forest landowners and forest managers in the South. If you do have any questions as we're moving through the webinar, then I would ask that you please put those in the chat box, or you can use the Q&A function. Those both should be on the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom screen right now. And we will address those questions with our speaker after he gives his presentation. So there'll be plenty of time to make comments and questions during that time. Without further ado, I will pass it over to our speaker today. As I said, this has been a project that has been established for many decades now, but most recently it has been championed by Auburn University. And I'm excited to introduce Dr. Adam Maggard, who is an associate professor in extension forestry and wildlife sciences at Auburn University. And he will be walking us through the latest iteration of the survey and some of the results that we got and some of the changes that we made to help landowners be able to use this information to make better decisions and more cost-effective decisions in their forest management. And with that, I will hand it over to you, Dr. Maggard.
Thank you for that, Lauren. I just want to start by thanking y'all for having me on today, and I really want to thank you for the partnership and working with the Forest Landowners Foundation and the association to really help expand this survey, reach more folks with it, and really try to improve it as much as we can. And I think we're done a lot over the last few years with it to try and do that. And I think we're starting to see those results in terms of just the sheer amount of folks we're able to reach with the survey, but also what we're able to do with the results going forward. So with that, I just want to thank y'all for all your assistance and help with that going forward. And yeah, so today, what I plan to do is I'll give you a little bit of background information. Some of you may be more familiar with the survey and its history than others, but I'll briefly touch on that. And then I want to go over some of the results, kind of talk about what we've seen and what we received from this past survey, how it related to some of the results we've seen over previous surveys, and then really take some time to discuss some of the what some of those results were, what the changes we had with the survey this time around, and what we want to continue to do with that survey, but then also take a few minutes to reintroduce you, or introduce some of you may be aware of the online dashboard that was created this year, and I want to make sure that I bring that up and show you what's going on there, as well as it is another tool for you to access as part of this survey. So with that, just briefly, the outline here, which I kind of already hit on, but I'll give you a little bit of background on the survey, talk about the methods and results, from this year, and then really get into that, looking at some of those results and what they mean, as well as talk about the online dashboard. So just to give you a little bit of the history, this survey does date back to the 1950s. The first results of the survey was published in 1952. And then the next version was in 1961, and it started to get a little more frequent from that point going on. I think it was on about every 3 to 5 years or so. They ran another version of the survey out. And then up until 1982, and then 1982, it really started on a kind of a cycle of going about every 2 years, and it's been that way since then. This past survey covering the 2022 year was the 27th version overall of this report going forward. It has changed hands over time. It was originally published by Albert C. Worrell, who's a professor of forest economics at Yale and also spent time before then on the forestry faculty at the University of Georgia, before switching hands, and eventually made its way to Auburn University. And I've been associated with this survey since about 2018, or the 2018 survey version of this report went out. So this is about the third cycle or so that I've kind of taken lead on in terms of being responsible for getting it out there. And a lot of what we've done over the last few years is really take a look back at how it's been done in the past. There wasn't a whole lot changed to that survey. A few of the cost of practices were updated from time to time as they were needed. But really up until recently, there was no significant changes in terms of complete overhauls really to the survey. It was pretty standard, tables on, paper handouts that you went through question by question or practice by practice and filled out by hand, and it was mailed to you and mailed back to us. And we really saw that being impacted, or at least, we picked up on that, at least since I've been around working on it, really a decrease in trend and participation in the survey. And, one of the things we thought we would do to improve that is, make it more user-friendly, put it online. That'll allow us to reach more folks, but it'll also be easier for folks to the goal was to make it easier for folks to participate in the survey. And I think we're getting there. I think we've done a lot to that to make that possible. And definitely what we've seen in terms of our reach and responses to the survey have definitely strengthened it as a result. So that's kind of where we are with the survey. The purpose originally was to, mainly to get an understanding of what the costs of various forestry practices were, what the present costs were at the time of the survey, but also to start gathering a database to study those long-term changes, those trends from year to year, to find out what's really driving those changes in our cost. And it became a pretty big standard in the industry, as a staple, as a resource to use for that. And then I guess it was about 2008 when we had the economic collapse and the housing market crash. We saw a lot, going back through the years, looking back at this survey, I saw a big change in participation in the survey, but also who was participating in the survey. And in more recent years, this survey has had an increase in, forest landowners that have participated in it. And prior to that, in the 80s and 90s and before that, it was largely driven by industrial landowners. So there has been a change, and we're working to definitely try to improve that across the board for all different types of providers and landowner types. We want to increase that across the board to try and get the best information possible in your hands going forward. So that's largely been our goal with kind of revamping this survey. So it really largely has followed standards from previous surveys. As I mentioned, the newest version of this survey, we have modified the questions. The questions are still there in large part, and the same practices for the most part, but we have tried to make those easier to answer. We have included some things to try and get more information about certain cost of practices that can help explain different changes we're seeing. But largely the results are based on the responses to the questionnaire of those major practices that we ask questions about. And then we report the weighted average cost. And that's really been the way it's been done in years past. And kind of leading up to what I'll talk about with the online dashboard is, one reason, there's multiple reasons why we wanted to launch that. One is, to try and get have a resource, have a tool out there for forest landowners and managers to access when they need it, but also to be able to sort that data and look exactly towards specific categories within these costs that are most relevant to you. And using the weighted average cost, just overall average for each of these practices does help us when we look at overall trends, but it's not, a lot more specific results can be broken down from this data. And we think that dashboard will definitely help do that. So we historically haven't run statistics on this data. It was just reported, reporting those overall averages. And I'll explain that more when I get to the dashboard going forward. So in 2022, it was distributed electronically, and we did that through various outlets. This was substantial help from the Forest Landowner Foundation and the Forest Landowner Association with this. That's really what's made this happen going forward. And of those distributed, which it's hard to keep track of exactly how many are distributed with online surveys, because how many you send to folks and how many people are on different email distribution lists. But what we don't know is who of those may afford it to other folks and so forth. So it's really kind of hard to keep track of exactly how many surveys reached how many hands. But of those that we did distribute, we did have 369 recorded responses. And of those responses, 296 of them were usable responses, meaning they had data that were usable and were included in the average of these costs going forward. And that's total of those respondents represented over 10 million acres across the region. So just to give you an idea, back in 2018, when I first came on board with this survey, I kind of came around to the point where, or got on board at the point where we were receiving responses from this survey. It had already been distributed. It was still all done through mail and hard copy. And there was a total of 85 total usable surveys that were recorded that year. And this year we had 296. So we're definitely reaching more folks. We're reaching more acres, and we're getting more cost, to help with those average costs. So I think the high prior to this was near about 150 completed surveys, and that was back in the late 80s, early 90s. And since the housing market crashed, like I said, we saw a significant decrease in participation, and found out, thought it was time to make a change to the survey going forward. So just to recap, we do cover the southern region. We cover from Texas and Oklahoma all the way east to the Atlantic coastal states of Virginia and South Carolina and North Carolina and Georgia down to Florida, and then back across. So we broke it down into 3 subregions to kind of categorize some of that data, being the southern coastal plain, the northern coastal plain, and then the Piedmont or similar uplands are the difference in those 3 subregions within the region that we are collecting the data from, just to give you an idea of what the distribution of this survey and what it's covering. So from 2022, what we really saw in terms of percent respondents, this was of that 296 usable survey responses. Family forest landowners made up about 54% of those. Consulting firms, practicing on non-industrial land, so they were working on private land, um, made up about or just under 30%. Industrial forest landowners were 12%, and then we had about 2.5% of those responses from publicly funded organizations, rounding out that total percentage of participants in this survey to kind of give you a breakdown of where this data is coming from. So based on the region, the subregions within the South, the northern coastal plain had the most responses coming from that subregion, about 43% of those. And then both the Piedmont and the southern coastal plain had the same amount of responses at just under 29% for this year. So to kind of break that down, look at that overall region and where these responses are coming from. In terms of states, the most usable questionnaires came from Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. But a bulk of that is from that central region, and it kind of dwindled off after that when you get some of the outer states when you look at this overall region as a whole. But the bulk of those came from those 3 states. We had responses from 13 of the 14 states that we surveyed total. So a little bit different than what has been happening in the past. Most of these practices have been tracked since 1952, with the exception of fertilization. It kind of came on in the 80s. And then we added technology as a category this year. And the purpose of that is to start tracking, things are changing. The way we map, use maps, the way we collect data, the way we track data on our forest land and use it for management, as well as the use of things like drone and LiDAR mapping. We wanted to start tracking that technology cost that's involved with some of these management practices and managing on your forest lands. So we added that category this year as well to that list of practices. So looking at the percent of usable surveys by forestry practice, this is looking at the main group there, the forestry practices going from chemical application to timber marking. Based on those percent surveys that we received, or that total number of surveys we received, this is the percentage of those that responded to these different questions regarding the different forestry practices. Chemical application had 94% response rate to it in terms of the 296 that responded. Planting came in at 71%, and then it kind of dwindled off little by little down to timber marking at about 11% of those respondents. I will mention that timber cruising, which in the past has been one of the top in terms of acres reported and participation in the survey, did decrease this year. I think timber cruising had over 500,000 acres less reported in 2022 than it did in 2020, and about 17% less respondents to that question than what we saw in 2020. In terms of the overall acreage, kind of relating to what I was saying there, the chemical application really shot up. We saw an increase in the number of acres from the respondents that reported chemical application herbicide work. And what we're seeing from that is an increase in the use of that in site preparation practice. Fertilization was, in terms of acreage, also increased than what we saw in years past, but most of those stayed pretty much the same, besides the timber cruising, which took a significant decrease in the number of acres reported this year. Timber marking has historically been the lowest reported and that continues to decrease. As you can see, it was simply just over 8,000 acres reported timber marking in this survey. And I believe in 2020 it was about 11,000. So it's still one of the lower reported practices, and that continues to kind of be the trend. In terms of the average cost per acre, and this is where, these are very handy for trends going forward and tracking those trends, but you have to know what you're looking at. And I'll give you some examples of that and why I think the dashboard going forward is going to be very beneficial. But this just kind of gives you an overall look on a cost per acre basis of what we found this year in the survey. And this is taking the overall average, regardless of what it is or what exactly that was being done as part of these treatments as a whole. And you can see that from mechanical site prep down to timber cruising. Another thing I'll point out with timber cruising is this is on a per acre basis, and the trends for that have been reported on a per acre basis in the past. But we started this year, I think a better way to do that is start collecting the cost per plot in terms of timber cruising. And we started doing that this year. So I think we're going to be able to get, more insight on that and be able to follow that trend more closely going forward in years to come, now that we've been able to establish that with this survey. So I'm not going to go through every single practice in detail. We just don't have the time, but I am going to focus on planting, as it seems to be one of the most, popular ones in terms of folks looking for or asking questions about. And overall this year, about 71% of those participants reported planting of some type, both machine or hand planting. It totaled over 185,000 acres. 55% of those acres reported were planted in bare root loblolly pine in the region. And bare root cost about 50% less than containerized seedlings in terms of planting cost. Hand planting cost was about 29% less than machine planting cost in this survey, and what we found. If you look at hand planting alone, I am going to show you this figure. So what this figure shows is both the nominal costs, which are the current reported costs from year to year, and then the real constant cost, which is adjusted for inflation. We did see that spike in those costs in hand planting back in 2018, which was, largely driven by some labor issues we had and we're dealing with back in 2016, 2017, and 2018. And in large part, I think we still are seeing that, but some of that has kind of lessened up in more recent years than what we saw it kind of peak out at in 2018. But hand planting made up over 107,000 acres in this survey, and we had an average seedling per acre or trees per acre planted at 561 with hand planting, and an overall average cost per seedling to plant of 12 cents per seedling. That does not include seedling cost. That is just what it cost per seedling to put it in the ground on average. So if you look at the figures and you look at the two lines, you have your nominal cost, which was just the actual overall average that was reported from year to year. And then you have it adjusted for inflation. So you can still see that inflation does have a substantial impact on our cost of forestry practices, and this is pretty similar across the board for all the practice types. And what we're seeing, that gap has increased between those two lines in recent years, and I can say that's the same for all these forest practice costs. But you can see that the hand planting did decrease slightly from 2020 to 2018, and I think that's largely driven from the fact that we, labor issues and what's going on with those labor issues. I think, that doesn't include the seedling cost as well. And I want to make that clear. And I think that's something that the dashboard is going to help with. if you look, and we're starting to track the cost per seedling to purchase now a lot better than we have in the past. And that cost per seedling to purchase seems to be trending upward. Uh, so it's getting more expensive for some of these seedlings, but they are a lot more in terms of genetics that are getting involved with these seedlings. So that's not something that is a shock to many of us. In terms of machine planting, the same thing. One thing that was a bit of a shock this year to us is if you look at this figure, that is the same thing as what I described on the last figure, the current cost versus the nominal cost with inflation, or adjusting for the inflation. We didn't see, in terms of the current cost, we saw uh, unchanged for machine planting when we were expecting to see an increase due to the surge in fuel prices in 2022. But we think that comes for a couple reasons. One, with machine planting, I think it depends on when it occurred and when we're capturing those data. So I think one thing we're going to do going forward is we're going to start tracking when folks respond to this survey. We want to start tracking when the planning actually occurred, so we can get a better sense of what may be impacting it. But more so than that, I think in this survey, machine planting, we feel comfortable saying machine planting is increasing in price. We think this survey may be a little different in this overall average number. And I think, again, that's where the dashboard is going to come into play, is that this overall average is taking into account whether it comes from family forest landowners, whether it comes from industry, whether it comes from private sector working on, industrial lands or non-industrial lands. And those costs vary. And this survey this year, the number of survey response that we saw from industrial lands was about 34% or so of the acreage reported for machine planting. And on average, machine planting on those lands was about 12% less than the overall average that we have listed here. And it was about 21% less than what was reported on private lands. So I think that's obviously having an impact on this overall average, and it may be in some extent having an impact on why it's masking the fuel cost response that we expected to see. Because the difference is a lot of times on the industrial land, some of those are contracted in, and some of those may have occurred prior to that surge in fuel cost and when that happened. So going forward, that's why we want to keep track of that better to understand when that occurs, what's going into that, and when exactly that planning happened, so we can keep better track of that. So, it may be a point too, where a lot of these are contracted ahead of time before they're actually the practice takes place. Going forward, it may easily be the fact that we just missed that surge in fuel price based on when this data was collected. So time will tell. It could be a lag phase there. We may be able to pick it up more on the next survey, but that's going to largely depend on what fuel prices do or fuel cost does from now through the next year or so. I want to show you this. I know it looks like, just a bunch of spaghetti noodles, but I want to make a point here. This is adjusted for inflation, and these are the overall costs from 1982 for each of these practices. If you look at the inflation side of it, and I was to kind of overlap this, we're definitely seeing trending upwards in cost due to that. With this, though, it's been a lot less stable over the last 15 years or so with this study than what we've seen over history, over time, back since this started, and especially since 1982. So I just want to point out just kind of how variable these costs can be from year to year, and what kind of goes into that in terms of what we're having to deal with each of these, and the importance of increasing the number of responses we get from year to year, and how we display the data or present the data out. So with the overall average cost, it looks like this. And I think if we were able to break that down as much as we wanted to with all of these practices, it wouldn't be as variable, but there's still going to be a lot of variation in the cost of forestry practices. And I just wanted to make that point. Essentially, there hasn't been a lot of stable, it hasn't been real stable with the cost of forestry practices over the last 15 years or so. So this just looks at the change, and this is the percent change, and this is your current cost. This isn't adjusted for inflation. From 2018 to the 2020 survey, this is the percent change in those costs of those practices, and then 2020 to 2022. The largest jump was marking trees for timber harvesting, and from 2020 to 2022, and that was largely driven by a lot of issues with getting raw material cost that goes into that paint for those trees. You can see there's articles online with that now. If you want to look up some of the paint companies, they're also still struggling with that inflated cost and being able to get that raw material. And we really saw that with this survey. But you can see overall, a lot of these prices are increasing. Like I said, we saw a slight decrease with hand planting. We saw a slight decrease with pre-commercial thinning, but largely these practices are increasing in cost from the previous survey that we saw. One thing I do want to point out is the machine planning, which we didn't see a change and we were expecting to. We definitely saw it with mechanical site prep, which I will show. And I think the mechanical site prep is also masked. So the point I'm trying to make there is I think we did catch some of the inflated fuel prices. I think the planning by machine that I talked about, I think those reasons are really driving that. But for mechanical site preparation, it still wasn't as extreme as we thought. But with the overall average in the past surveys, that's including things like all single pass responses, double pass responses, and triple pass responses. And that's one thing that needs to be really put an asterisk by when you're looking at overall averages of what's going into those prices. And in terms of trends, it's still showing that we're going up in price. But when you look at what you're actually comparing, you can actually see a significant difference when the actual change from 2020 to 2022 was a 27% increase. And what we're looking at here is the average cost per acre for mechanical site preparation, but for single passes only. In 2022, we only had enough data to publish on single passes only. That was majority of what was reported. And in prior years, we had enough data to publish that overall average using all three types of passes, which kind of inflated some of those numbers to a certain extent compared to what the overall average was that was reported. So if you pulled those out and you looked at 2018 and 2020, and you looked at just single passes alone versus what single pass cost per acre for mechanical site preparation is today, you can see the difference there. And it's just around 27% or so. The other thing I want to point out is we're seeing a decreasing trend away from mechanical site preparation as well. Those acreages are decreasing, and a lot of that is going more towards chemical site prep. So just another slide here before I'm about to finish up and take you to the dashboard, but just to kind of have a discussion here about what's influencing these costs. And if you look at some of these costs directly, in terms of prescribed burning, we're expecting that to increase, continuing to go forward. Wages and fuel are going to have an impact on that, but we also think just the pure standpoint of liability and policy are also going to have a major impact on that, pushing those costs going upwards going forward. Timber cruising and marking, The raw material costs, we caught that this survey. That's one of those things that's not going to be there consistently from year to year, or you're going to expect to happen. But when it does happen, these are the type of practices that are significantly impacted by it. And we're also seeing a decreasing trend in participation in that practice across the board. So the acres marked continue to decrease, or at least are what's being reported. And then in terms of fertilization, you're going to have fertilizer cost increases. You're going to have fuel cost increases that are going to be significant impacts on that going forward. We did see a few more responses in terms of acres reported in fertilization this time around. But I think largely, I don't know if it's necessarily a combination of more people are doing it. I think we're reaching more folks with the survey, and we're collecting more of that information. And then mechanical site preparation, fuel costs historically has been a major factor. There's a decreasing demand I talked about. A lot of that's being substituted out for chemical site prep. Increased efficiency equipment. So we are seeing a decreasing trend in the number of passes that are taking to do this, and money spent on mechanical site preparation in combination with just a decrease in its use. Survey changes, that's another thing, like I said, and that's why we largely want to focus on this dashboard. Is there's a lot of changed in the last 4 years, 5 years, 6 years with this survey, and it's not standard of just, we're not just surveying industry folks. We're not just surveying TMOs and REITs. We're not just surveying family forest landowners. We're surveying all of the above, and we want to be able to break that out as much as possible. So we still have to do and work on improving the overall responses from each of those groups and who's participating in this survey, but that's obviously going to have an impact on your overall average cost per practice. And that's why we want to have enough responses to be able to use that dashboard, break those out, and be able to find the average data that is most practical for you to use. So I am going to jump ahead to the dashboard due to the sake of time. If you want to look at that dashboard, I have the link here. I am going to stop share on my computer briefly just so I can reshare it with the dashboard up. But the link is there, so just bear with me for 1 second. And okay, everybody should be able to see the dashboard here in front of me. This is our home screen. It kind of gives you some information about the costs and trends of forestry practices, the survey in general. But a couple of things I wanted to point out with this is, for example, if we go to mechanical site preparation or we go to tree planting, you can sort this by provider type. So you can look at which of these, what the overall averages were from each of these providers. Right now, with none of them clicked, it's giving me the overall average for all of them. So basically all the data. You can also sort it by region, and you can also sort it by state. So you can click on each of these states and see what the overall average was from these states and take a look at that. So for example, what I was talking about earlier, if you look at industrial lands and you look at machine planting down here, these are the regions across the top. So make sure you go to the total. This is the overall average. If you look at that, machine planting is sitting in right around 16 cents with cost per planting per seedlings about 16 cents. If you look at consultants on non-industrial private land, that machine planting cost jumps up to about 20 cents. So instead of looking at that overall average, this is, another reason why we want to have this resource available, this information available, so you can really do more with that data that we're collecting and get more from that than just the overall average. The trends and stuff and what we follow, that's one thing, but looking at some of this, if you're a family forest landowner, you want to look at what the overall average costs were for a family forest landowner, not for industrial lands or not for public lands. So that's one nice tool with this dashboard. In terms of mechanical site preparation, again, you can break it down by practice. We have a lot more practices or methods used for that here, but you can look at it from different passes too, in terms of double pass or single pass, and break that number down instead of relying on that overall average. So just kind of an overview there. You can look at it on a state by state basis. You can look at it on a regional basis or sub-region basis, and you can look at it on by a provider type basis. If there's a blank number there, that's because we didn't get enough data to put that information into the system. We also are tracking historical trend data, so you can pull up nominal and constant cost for each of these practices dating back as far as we have it. We still are working on some of these, adding as much data as we can from historical surveys to that for you to look at. But you can take a look at that per cost, practice costs, which are listed here on the top. And we started collecting sources of cost share information as well across the board to help make sense of some of the costs and what's actually being done out there in terms of management on forest lands from the cost share perspective. So all this information is available there on the dashboard. I definitely encourage you to take a look at that. And if you have questions or you're having a hard time navigate the tables within each of these costs, definitely don't hesitate to reach out to me and we'll help you with that. But you can download these tables or copy and paste them into Excel, whatever you want to do to take a better look at the data you need. I just caution the fact that, when we have these responses, 296 responses for the survey was the total N. When you start breaking it down, that starts to shrink dramatically. So, take that with a grain of salt because we put everything we had in here. So, some of these costs may be reflective of just a few respondents. So make sure you understand what you're looking at in that regard. But we're hoping to continue to increase that as much as possible in years to come to make that better and better. Okay, so I'm gonna switch back. I think that's about all I have. I will, let me see here. Let me share my screen. So I just want to again thank everyone that has participated in this survey and helped distribute this survey out to folks. And I definitely want to thank the Forest Landowner Foundation for their partnering with this to help improve it and make it a great tool or as good a tool as we possibly can going forward. And I'll be happy to take any questions that we may have.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Maggard. That was a great presentation, very thorough. And it's exciting to see that online dashboard up there and knowing that as we continue to get more and more responses from across the South, those numbers will keep going up and give us better and better data and a clearer and clearer picture of what some of those costs and trends are. We do have a few questions that have come in, and I've got a couple myself, but as we're discussing this with Dr. Maggard, please feel free to put any questions that you all may have in the Q&A or in the chat. The first question that came in was with regard to, I think the slide that you were on was the forestry practices by acre reported, by acres reported and by average cost. And David Dole wanted to ask, does chemical application over there on the right of that bar graph, does chemical application include both establishment and mid-rotation work?
It does.
If so, would it be feasible or beneficial to separate chemical application by prescription type?
It does, and that's what historically, that's one big issue with the survey in the past is that chemical application has been kind of grouped together as an overall average. So that's even more so kind of why we wanted to create this dashboard is in that dashboard, you'll be able to break that out better, whether it's herbaceous weed control, whether it's mid-rotation management, whether it's site preparation. This number this year has been largely driven by site preparation, but the overall average is going to include all of those responses to that question. That's why with a dashboard, we're able to break that down and actually look at the overall average that's more applicable to what you're looking for. So if you're looking for, herbaceous weed control, then you can go through that dashboard and be able to sort those responses that were reported for that subcategory rather than getting the overall average.
Excellent, thank you. And David did have one more question for you. Has there been either an upward or downward trend in the seedlings per acre planted? That's a great
Yeah,
question.
I overall what we've seen at least over the last few years, a downward trend in the trees per acre planted or seedlings per acre planted. I want to say this year is 561. I think the prior year, don't hold me to this, but it was closer to 580 or 590. And I've seen it up over 600 in recent reports. And even way back when it was even higher. But I think that's a combination of, I think that's really highlighting our improvement in seedling genetics and seedling quality and what you're getting. Our survival rates have, survival after planting's not largely been an issue compared to what it has been in years, way back in years past. We've significantly improved that with the survival and establishment of those seedlings. And since the overall trees per acre has declined as a result.
Great. And then I had a couple of questions for you. One of them was about the slide where you broke out the different types of respondents and the different types of stakeholder groups that we're reaching with this survey. And this has been sort of something that I've toyed with a lot in my research and during my career, but I'm wondering if the respondents to this survey, did they self-select into one of these categories, or did you as the researcher place
No,
them
so
in
with this
categories?
survey, we sent the survey out and then they select which category they're reporting from.
Okay.
Yep.
Excellent. No, thank you for that. And then I just wanted to give you an opportunity also to tell us about future plans for the survey. I know that you and I and some of the other folks at the foundation and the association have started discussing what comes next, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to share some of your ideas and thoughts.
Yeah, so I guess I want to start by, saying that we definitely want to hear back from folks. We know it's not as perfect as it possibly could be, but it's a lot better than it has been. And we want to continue that trend. We want to continue refining it and making it as most, applicable and as most relevant as we can as a resource tool. So we definitely want to hear back from folks. So if you have suggestions, if you have ideas, if you have things, if you participated in the survey this past year and you have ideas on things that could improve that, definitely don't be shy in letting us know. That's something we want to know. That's one of the main ways we can make improvements on this is hearing from folks on what their needs are, but also what can make it easier for them to participate. I think Lauren, going forward, our focus is going to be, I think we continue to improve and strive to get as many responses as possible. I think the more responses we get, it's only going to help our data and help our numbers. I think that's going to be especially important with the online dashboard. You're not looking at 296 in an overall average for responses now. With the online dashboard, there's some of those practices that may only have 5 responses. If you really start to break that down, kind of going back to that example of chemical application, that overall average is across the board. So if we start breaking that down into herbaceous weed control or, hack and squirt methods or, site prep, those costs are going to vary significantly and the responses we get for each of those costs are going to vary significantly. So we got to strive to continue to improve those responses, the folks we reach with this survey, to do that. And then I think going forward is making sure that, continuing to make sure that we're making it as user friendly as possible to take, time sensitive, but also understanding that we have to ask these questions. It's not going to ever be a survey that's going to take you 3 minutes to complete, but we got to try and make it as easy as possible for folks to participate in it, user friendly, and refine the questions to make sure we're collecting the data that's going to be most useful. And one thing, you always think of new things to collect, and I think next year one thing we're going to add is we're going to ask for when, if you report planting costs, we want to know what time of year that happened, and get as much information as we possibly can about that to help make sense of some of these results. So I think going forward, it's going to be staying on new things, staying on top of how things change and how cost of practices change. We talked about the technology. Right now it's kind of just blanketed towards technology, but and the results showed that this year it was a mixed bag of everything, right? We had all kinds of responses to that, but I think we need to start, that'll start to iron itself out, and we'll start to be able to track more of that going forward, and just be able to refine these questions going forward to make sure they're still relevant and still being asked the way they should be asked.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And I did want to just let our listeners to this webinar know that the foundation and Auburn are in agreement to continue this partnership into the next phase of the survey. So we will be working together on the next round and continually trying to improve it, just as Dr. Maggard was saying. And we really appreciate the supporters of the foundation and our other funding sources like the U.S. Forest Service for helping us to be able to do this really important work for forest landowners and forest managers on the ground across the South and maybe someday beyond. We'll see. But thank you everyone for attending the webinar today. I did want to draw your attention with Michelle Kane and I did put a few links into the chat in case you want to click on those now and have the dashboard open in your web browser. And Michelle did say that one of those links that we put in there does have a webinar on how to navigate that dashboard as well. So that can be a great resource as you dig into the data a little bit further on your own after the webinar. But I want to give a big thank you to Dr. Maggard and Auburn University and all our support to make this project happen, to all of our listeners who are learning about this through this webinar. And thank you, everyone. And I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you all, and thanks for everyone tuning in.